A blizzard. A desperate mother. A life or death choice. When Ethan Carter opened the door that night, he had no idea that his quiet life was about to change forever. A starving German shepherd stood in the snow, sheltering two frail puppies beneath her trembling body. She had fought through the storm, but she had nothing left but hope. What Ethan didn't realize was that this wasn't just a stray dog. She was running from something, and someone. As he sheltered her, his trust began to grow, but so did the danger lurking in the darkness. Now the blizzard howled across the mountains, its icy fingers clawing at the walls of the log cabin. The wind pounded against the structure, rattling the windows as if trying to get inside. Snow quickly piled up on the porch, a thick, unforgiving layer that obliterated everything below. Inside, a dim light flickered, warning that the power might not hold much longer. Ethan Carter sat alone in his chair, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The heat seeped into his fingers, but it did little to warm the lingering cold in the room. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, its orange glow flickering across the walls. Outside, the wind shrieked, swallowing the world in white. He had been snowed in for 2 days now, but solitude had never bothered him until now. Something about this storm felt different, heavier, as if the world was waiting for something to break. Then it came. A sound. Soft, barely there, yet distinct enough to send a ripple through the silence. A faint scratching. Ethan frowned, setting down his mug. His first thought was the wind-loose branches scraping against the cabin. Ice shifting in the storm. He waited, listening. Nothing. Then it happened again. A whisper of movement against wood, followed by something else. A muffled whimper. His heartbeat quickened. He stood, every instinct on alert. Living alone in a remote cabin, you learn to trust your gut. And right now, his gut was telling him something, or someone was out there. He moved cautiously toward the door, his boots silent against the wooden floor. Through the frosted glass, he could see nothing but a swirling curtain of snow. Still, the sound had been real. He wasn't imagining it. He reached for the light switch by the door, flipping on the porch lamp. And then he saw it. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. A German shepherd stood just beyond the threshold, hunched against the cold. Her body was thin, too thin, her ribs pressing through a coat matted with ice and snow. But it was her eyes that stopped him. Wide, desperate, locked onto his with a silent plea. Beneath her, barely visible against the snow, were 2 tiny puppies, huddled against her frail frame. The wind lashed at them, whipping their small bodies, but the mother didn't move. She remained where she was, shielding them, a living barrier between them and the elements. Ethan swallowed, his hand hovering over the door handle. His mind raced. A stray dog showing up in the middle of a blizzard? That was rare enough. But a starving mother carrying 2 helpless pups through a storm like this? That wasn't luck. That was desperation. He knew what taking them in would mean. It wouldn't just be 1 dog, it would be 3. 3 mouths to feed, 3 lives suddenly dependent on him. And he wasn't sure he was ready for that. He hadn't had a dog in years, not since. Ethan clenched his jaw. This wasn't about him. Outside, the German shepherd swayed slightly, her legs trembling. She was exhausted. If she had made it here, she had fought to get here. She had chosen his cabin. And now, he had a choice to make. For a split second, he hesitated. Then he opened the door. The storm roared inside, slamming into him like an icy wall, but he barely noticed. The mother dog didn't move at first. She just stood there, watching him, as if she couldn't believe what was happening. Then, after a long, agonizing pause, she took a single step forward. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around them. But the German shepherd trembled even harder. Her body, ravaged by the cold, struggled to adjust. For a moment, Ethan worried she might collapse. He grabbed an old blanket from the couch, carefully draping it over her. Up close, she looked worse than he had realized. Her paws were cracked and raw, the pads split from exposure to ice. Her fur, once thick and strong, was now matted and patchy, clinging to a body that had clearly known hunger for too long. Old scars ran along her side, evidence of a past that made Ethan's gut tighten. She didn't flinch at his touch, but she didn't relax either. Her body remained coiled, tense, ready to fight if she had to. Then, a soft sound, a whimper. Ethan's gaze dropped. One of the puppies lay motionless, its tiny body unnaturally still. His breath hitched. He knelt down slowly, reaching out, but the mother let out a low, warning growl. Not aggressive. Not threatening. A mother's instinct. Ethan stopped. He met her eyes, saw the fire still burning behind her exhaustion. "All right, girl. I get it," he murmured, raising both hands in surrender. "You're a damn good mom." Her growl faded, but she remained watchful. Ethan moved carefully, setting a bowl of warm water near her. She hesitated. nostrils flaring as she took in the scent, but thirst eventually won over caution. She lowered her head and lapped at the water, her movements slow, deliberate. The puppies, sensing movement from their mother, stirred weakly. The stronger one wriggled closer, nuzzling into her warmth. The other barely moved. Ethan exhaled, forcing himself to step back. He had done what he could for now. Pushing too hard wouldn't help. He returned to his chair, keeping a careful eye on them as the fire flickered softly in the hearth. They were safe for now. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a world blanketed in fresh snow, the air crisp and still. Ethan stood by the window, staring out at the quiet landscape, watching as the first rays of sunlight glistened on the icy world outside. The German Shepherd and her pups lay near the fire, their bodies curled tightly together for warmth. The pups had begun to show signs of life, their small bodies wriggling as they nursed from their mother. But there was still something haunting about the scene. They had come from somewhere, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to their story than met the eye. He knew he couldn't waste any more time. The mother dog and her pups needed medical attention. He had never intended for this to be his responsibility, but now, it seemed inevitable. He had to help. After a quick breakfast, Ethan set to work preparing for the journey. The snow had stopped falling, but the roads were still treacherous, icy and slick. His truck had already been buried under a few feet of snow, but he managed to dig it out, using the last of his strength to clear the way. He knew getting them to the veterinary clinic wouldn't be easy, especially with a dog as protective as Grace. The first challenge came as he attempted to load them into the truck. Grace remained tense, her eyes locked on Ethan as he tried to pick up one of the puppies. She wasn't ready to trust him fully yet. Even after the warmth of the cabin, after he had given her space, the bond between them was still fragile. She growled softly as Ethan reached for the smaller of the two pups, her body coiled with protective instinct. Ethan paused, giving her a few moments. He didn't want to rush her, but he had to get them to safety. Finally, Grace took a tentative step back, her eyes still wary. Slowly, she allowed Ethan to lift the puppies, one by one, into the truck bed. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as if every action had to be measured. Once they were settled, Grace hesitated. Ethan held his breath. Would she refuse to come with them? Would she try to leave? But after a long, agonizing moment, she stepped forward. She climbed into the truck, settling herself carefully between her pups, her posture still stiff. Ethan's heart rate settled slightly as he slammed the truck door shut, knowing it would be a rough ride but feeling a sense of relief that they were all going together. He didn't want to lose any of them. The drive to the clinic was slow, every turn a careful maneuver as he navigated the icy roads. He gripped the steering wheel with both hands, his knuckles white from the pressure. The truck slid at one point, slipping toward a snowbank. Ethan's foot slammed on the brake just in time, the truck skidding and almost tipping over before he regained control. The sudden shock of it made his heart skip a beat. His eyes shot to Grace. She was still calm, still watching over her pups. Even as the truck swayed, she remained perfectly still, her gaze fixed on him. But there was no fear in her eyes, only trust. When they finally arrived at the clinic, Ethan was exhausted. He helped the staff unload the dogs, Grace still guarding her pups as if they were her last link to survival. They took the three of them inside, and Ethan was left to wait anxiously in the sterile waiting room. It didn't take long before Dr. Monroe appeared, clipboard in hand. "She's resilient, Doctor," Monroe said, nodding toward Grace, "but she's also severely malnourished." Ethan's eyes narrowed, a sinking feeling settling in his stomach. "She's been on her own for a while," the vet continued, flipping through the notes. "It's clear she's been through a lot. But she made it here against all odds." Ethan clenched his fists. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of anger that someone would let her get to this point. "She's been abandoned," Dr. Monroe added, looking up at him. "That much is clear. Her condition. It suggests she's been on the streets, or worse, for far too long." Ethan's mind raced. Who had done this to her? He wanted to ask more, but before he could, Dr. Monroe looked at the pups. "They're in bad shape too. Weak. But they're fighters. They'll make it with some care." Ethan nodded slowly, swallowing back the wave of emotion that threatened to rise up. He couldn't let them down now. He couldn't let them suffer any more than they already had. As the vet staff worked on the dogs, Ethan found himself pacing in the waiting room. His thoughts clouded with questions. Where had Grace come from? Who was responsible for her condition? He kept thinking about the way she had arrived at his doorstep, how desperate and vulnerable she had looked, yet how fiercely protective she was of her pups. Her past was a mystery he had to unravel. He stood up abruptly, walking over to the counter where a clinic worker was sorting through paperwork. "Do you know if anyone's reported a German Shepherd like her?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. The woman glanced up, shaking her head. "We get a lot of strays," she said. "But no one has come looking for a dog like that. She's been through a lot abandoned, left to fend for herself. That's not uncommon around here." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Abandoned. It echoed in his mind as he thought back to the way Grace had looked when she first arrived, so desperate. So broken. Who could have left her like that? Ethan sat on the porch steps, his breath rising in the cold morning air, as he watched the German shepherd rest near the fireplace inside. She was still wary, still watching his every move, but something had shifted. She had made it through the worst. She deserved a name. Grace, Ethan murmured to himself, testing the word. It felt right. She was a survivor, resilient and unwavering. A name like Grace suited her. The pups had earned their own too. Snow, for the storm that nearly claimed them. Ash, for the warmth of the fire that saved them. Inside, Grace lifted her head slightly as if sensing his thoughts, then returned to grooming her pups. For the first time, Ethan let himself believe they might be okay. In the days that followed, Grace's trust in him grew slowly, cautiously, but undeniably. At first, she still watched from a distance, always positioning herself between him and her pups. But as the hours passed, the tension in her posture softened. She began eating while he was in the room instead of waiting for him to step away. She started responding to his voice, her ears flicking when he spoke. Then, one night, it happened. Ethan had dozed off in his chair by the fire, exhaustion finally overtaking him. He woke hours later to find the room bathed in dim light, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Something was different. He glanced down and his breath caught. Grace had moved closer. Her head was resting lightly against his knee, her body relaxed for the first time since she had arrived. Ethan stayed perfectly still, unwilling to break the moment. She had chosen to trust him. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Still, unease lingered beneath the surface. Something about Grace's arrival, about the way she had found his cabin, the state she had been in, the way she listened to things Ethan couldn't hear, none of it sat right. Then, one night, his instincts were proven right. A sharp growl shattered the stillness. Ethan jerked awake, the low, rumbling sound reverberating through the cabin. Grace was no longer resting by the fire. She was at the window. Her body was rigid, fur bristling, a deep, primal growl rising from her throat. Ethan's stomach tightened. He moved slowly, keeping his breathing steady as he followed her gaze. The porch light barely illuminated the world outside, casting long shadows across the snow. But then he saw it, a figure, standing at the edge of the trees, watching. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. Someone was out there. Grace growled again, lower this time, but just as fierce. Ethan reached for the rifle, leaning against the wall, gripping it tightly. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They had been standing there, waiting. And Grace knew them. The tension in the cabin was suffocating. Since the night Ethan had seen the figure in the woods, Grace had been different. She no longer slept peacefully by the fire. She paced. Every sound outside made her ears twitch. Some nights, she sat by the door, completely still, staring into the darkness as if waiting for something or someone to return. Ethan had spent years trusting his instincts. They had saved him more times than he could count. And right now, every instinct in his body screamed that something wasn't right. Then, one morning, the uneasy silence shattered. A vicious bark tore through the air. Ethan barely had time to react before Grace lunged at the door, snarling so ferociously that her whole body trembled with rage. Snow and Ash, startled awake, whimpered as they scurried to a corner. Ethan grabbed his rifle and strode to the door, his pulse pounding. Grace had never reacted like this before. He yanked it open and froze. A man stood on the porch. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face shadowed beneath the hood of a thick jacket. But it was his expression that sent a wave of cold fury through Ethan. He was smirking. "That's my dog," the man said, his voice calm, almost amused. Ethan's grip on the rifle tightened. His gut told him this wasn't just some lost pet situation. He didn't lower the gun. "If she's yours, why the hell did I find her half dead in the middle of a blizzard?" The man shrugged, completely unfazed. "She got out. Happens sometimes." Ethan didn't believe that for a second. Behind him, Grace let out a snarl so deep, so furious, that it sent a shiver down his spine. She recognized him. And she hated him. Ethan barely had time to react before Grace lunged forward. Her entire body tensed, muscles coiling as she snapped at the air between her and the man. She would have gone straight for his throat, if Ethan hadn't grabbed her collar at the last second. She wasn't just defending herself. She was attacking. The man took an instinctive step back, his smirk finally faltering. He wasn't expecting this. Ethan pulled Grace back, though he could feel the raw strength beneath his grip. She was fighting to get to him. And the man knew it. The smirk returned, but it wasn't as confident this time. More calculated, more dangerous. "You're making a mistake, old man," he said, adjusting his jacket. "That dog's trouble. You don't know what you've got on your hands." Ethan's voice was ice. "The only trouble I see is the man standing on my porch." The man held Ethan's gaze for a long, heavy moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the tree line. But before disappearing into the woods, he did one last thing. He paused. Then, ever so slightly, he turned and smiled. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat in his chair by the window, rifle resting across his lap, eyes fixed on the dark woods beyond his property. The man had left, but the threat hadn't. Grace lay near the door, ears pricked, every muscle in her body tense. She hadn't moved since the man disappeared, her gaze locked on the same spot in the tree line. She wasn't just alert, she was waiting. Then, just past midnight, headlights appeared at the end of the long, snow-covered road leading to Ethan's cabin. A truck, it slowed. Stopped. But it never pulled in. Instead, the engine cut off, and the lights flicked out. For nearly 5 minutes, nothing happened. The vehicle just sat there in the darkness, watching without moving, without making a sound. Ethan's fingers tightened around the rifle. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he didn't move. Didn't blink. He knew exactly what this was. A message, a warning. Then, just as silently as it had arrived, the truck came back to life. The engine hummed, the tires crunched softly over the ice, and it drove away. Ethan exhaled slowly, his grip never loosening. He didn't relax. Not yet. Because Grace hadn't moved. She stood firm, watching the road long after the truck had vanished, her tail raised, her stance steady. Not afraid. Not anymore. The man was gone. But if he came back this time, she would be ready. Days passed. Each morning, Ethan expected to find another set of footprints in the snow. Another sign that the past wasn't finished with them. Another reason to keep his rifle loaded by the door. But no one came. No shadows in the woods. No figures lingering in the distance. No headlights flashing through the trees at night. The tension slowly began to fade. Grace stopped pacing by the windows. The sharp alertness in her posture softened. For the first time since she arrived at his doorstep, she seemed at peace. And with that peace, something else changed. She no longer sat near the door, waiting. Instead, she stayed close to Ethan. She followed him to the woodshed when he chopped firewood. She watched as he worked on his truck, lying nearby in the sun. She no longer flinched when he reached out to pet her. She leaned into his touch now. She trusted him. The first warm morning of spring arrived like an old friend, melting the last of the winter's grip on the mountains. The snow had receded, revealing patches of brown earth. The air smelled different, fresh, alive. Ethan stood at the front door, looking out at the world that had finally begun to thaw. He turned to Grace, who sat beside him, ears flicking at the soft rustling of wind through the trees. Without a word, he pushed the door open. For the first time, he let her go. For a long moment, Grace didn't move. Then, slowly, she stepped forward. She didn't hesitate. Didn't look back in fear. She walked out onto the porch, down the steps, and onto the soft earth. And then, for the first time since that brutal winter night, she took a deep breath. Not a frantic gasp for survival. A breath of freedom. Ethan watched her. Something tight in his chest loosening as she closed her eyes and simply stood there, feeling the sun on her fur, the earth beneath her paws. She wasn't running anymore. She had nowhere to run from. He stepped forward, crouching down beside her. His hand brushed over her fur, and she turned her head, pressing into him. "You're home now, girl." For the first time since they met, her tail wagged. Just once. Just a small, uncertain flick. But Ethan felt it. Felt what it meant. She believed him. As the weeks passed, Grace wasn't just a dog Ethan had saved. She was his shadow, his companion, his family. Snow and ash grew stronger, their tiny legs no longer struggling to keep up as they tumbled around the cabin. Their mother watched over them, but now, she let Ethan watch over them too. One evening, as the fire crackled and the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan sat in his chair, feeling something he hadn't in years. Contentment. Grace lay at his feet, one paw resting lightly on his boot. The pups slept nearby, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each breath. Ethan reached down, running his fingers through Grace's fur. She sighed, shifting closer. He had taken her in out of instinct, thinking he was the one saving her. But the truth was, she had saved him, too. Some rescues go both ways. Ethan had given Grace and her pups a second chance, but in the end, she had given him something just as valuable, a reason to open his heart again. She had arrived at his doorstep in the middle of a raging storm, clinging to life. Now, she roamed freely beside him, no longer a shadow of her past but a part of his future. How many times do we think we're saving an animal, only to realize they're the ones saving us? If Grace's story moved you, consider making a difference. Adopt, support your local shelter, or simply share this story to spread awareness. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who believes in second chances. Together, we can change lives one rescue at a time.